Well, the court battles between the public protector on one side and President Cyril Ramaphosa and Pravin Gordhan on the other has plunged the country into a credibility crisis. That's according to political analyst Daniel Silke. Now, you'll remember as well that those findings by Busisiwe Mkhwebane are being taken on review. Silke joins me now via Skype from Cape Town to unpack some of his views. Mr. Silke, thank you very much for your time. So, you say that the country faces a credibility crisis on three fronts. I'd like for you, in bullet form, to just name these crises very quickly for us before we touch on other matters.
Hello, well, thanks very much for having me. Look, crisis number one really was an offshoot of the evidence given by former President Zuma at the beginning of last week, when he effectively created a kind of McCarthy-esque scenario within the ANC of spy versus legitimate cadre. So there is a crisis within the ANC itself and how the ANC sees its own cadres, legitimate or otherwise. The second crisis, I would argue, is clearly within the Office of the Public Protector herself, the judgments already against her and the critiques of her just over the course of the last few days as well. The High Court decision against her does bring that office into a crisis of credibility. And thirdly, of course, the Public Protector's own critique of President Ramaphosa and the innuendos created around the lack of knowledge that President Ramaphosa showed in accepting donations, in possible obfuscation, in possible criminal intent. All of that creates a crisis of credibility in the office of the presidency as well.
Now, on the question of Ramaphosa's moral authority when it comes to corruption, I'd like you to answer this question for you. Is the office of the president facing a credibility crisis right now?
Well, I think that a credibility crisis has been created around the office of the presidency. And I do think that these accusations coming from a key institution like the Office of the Public Protector is a serious dent in the armor of President Ramaphosa. Clearly, whilst you correctly said the matter is going on judicial review, and it's very possible that much of what has been said will be set aside, doubts have been created about the president, and indeed the president going forward will have to be a lot more informed. He'll have to communicate a lot better as well, and he clearly will need aides and staffers who are going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's to prevent this kind of situation emerging again. Otherwise, President Ramaphosa will find himself in difficulty on other issues going forward.
Mr. Silke, in your article, you also mentioned there that the president right now, his enemies are circling around him, and it puts pressure on him to be beyond reproach. Question, therefore, is what happens if the CR17 donor case goes against him in the courts, and vice versa, the public protector?
Well, clearly, if the president is besmirched in any way, given the appeal and the review, this is going to be manna for heaven for the president's enemies. And I'm not convinced that, of course, this threatens necessarily the position of Cyril Ramaphosa as president, even if the judgments went against him. But I tell you that I think it's going to make for an extremely uncomfortable year or two for him, and there may well be efforts to put him aside, let us say, by 2021 when the next ANC conference takes place. So I think that we run the risk here of weakening President Ramaphosa, and I do think that these accusations, until they are refuted by the courts, are going to swirl around the head of President Ramaphosa, and they simply give fuel to the president's enemies, to the factions that would rather see someone else perhaps installed in the presidency. And I do think it also creates a material for fresh allegations in future as well. So that's a very serious position for South Africa, to have both the Office of the Public Protector and the Office of the Presidency both under this kind of extreme scrutiny and indeed under this kind of questioning.
On the former President Zuma, you mentioned him at the very start, that you make the point in your article that he has a severely damaged credibility. So question is, therefore, why should the country worry or take any of his claims seriously?
Yes, I think that his credibility certainly is largely shot. However, there is a broad body, perhaps within the ANC and perhaps on the periphery of the ANC, who feel as though President Zuma has been a victim, and he played that victim card very, very well in his evidence at the beginning of last week. Now, what he did, whether you believe him or not, was to sow a degree of doubt within the ANC as to who is genuine, who's a genuine cadre, and who isn't, who's a spy. That's debilitating. Again, whether you believe he doesn't have any credibility in his own message, to have those accusations hurled within the governing party, a governing party that's always been sensitive to this issue of spies and the role of individuals in supporting the apartheid regime, that brings up the old wounds within the ANC. It makes members look askance at one another with great degrees of suspicion. It's not healthy for a political party to have its own internal credibility questioned by, indeed, a former president who was a former president only till recently and still carries a degree of support or sympathy within a large body of South Africans. And I think that creates a sense of unease within the ANC that boils over as these troubles between Cyril Ramaphosa and the public protector also simultaneously play themselves out.
So just finally, therefore, Mr. Silke, with all these issues that you've mentioned on the go, how do we ensure as a country that we do not disengage the process of holding those responsible for state capture to account? Because this might clearly be a diversion from that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we did see a diversion to a degree. The week started with former President Zuma facing accusations of complicity in state capture, and it ended in a sense with innuendos regarding the current president being involved in some sort of state capture given the funding of his campaign. So I think that there are diversionary tactics at play here, but ultimately it's the quality of our institutions that really count, and South Africans really have to become a lot more, I think, demanding of the independence of our institutions. We've unfortunately had a period in which our institutions have been diminished. We're now in hopefully a period of recovery, but it's up to the citizens of South Africa really to keep their finger on the button of accountability of government and the institutions that largely support governance in South Africa. And if South Africans sort of just bury their heads in the sand and look away, then I think this kind of infighting and this palace intrigue that does our economy and credibility of a country no good will continue. And I think that's really how we safeguard ourselves in the future. It's all about institutional integrity within the country and how us as citizens force that integrity and hold it to account.
Daniel Silke, thank you very much for your insights. He is a director of the Political Futures Consultant.